Daniel Harper woke up that Saturday morning with a strange feeling he could not explain. The air outside his apartment in Maplewood was cool and bright, the kind of morning that made the whole town feel calm and alive at the same time. For weeks, his life had felt heavy and quiet. Work, home, sleep, repeat. Nothing special, nothing new. So when he decided to walk to the farmer's market, it was not part of any big plan. He only wanted fresh fruit, maybe some bread, and a few minutes where his mind could rest. He put on his jacket, grabbed his wallet, and stepped outside, not knowing that the day was about to change in a way he never expected. The farmer's market was already full when Daniel arrived. People were everywhere. Couples carrying baskets, children running between stalls, and older vendors smiling while arranging vegetables on wooden tables. A man was playing guitar near a coffee cart, and the soft music mixed with the smell of roasted beans and warm pastries. Daniel moved slowly through the crowd. The energy of the place felt good after spending so many quiet weekends alone. He stopped at a stand selling apples, picked up a few, then walked to another stall filled with jars of colorful jam. The vendor greeted him, but Daniel barely noticed because his mind had wandered back to the past, something that happened more often than he liked to admit. 3 years had passed since his divorce from Emily Collins, but some memories still stayed close to him. Not in a painful way all the time, but in a quiet, unfinished way. He remembered the early days of their relationship, how easy it was to talk, how excited they had been about building a life together. Back then, weekends were full of road trips, laughter, and family dinners at Emily's parents' house. Daniel had always liked those dinners. The house was warm, the conversations were lively, and Emily's mother, Margaret, had always made him feel welcome. She treated him with kindness from the very beginning, like he already belonged there. But things changed over time. Life became busy. Work pressures grew. Small arguments slowly became bigger ones. Daniel and Emily stopped understanding each other the way they used to. They tried to fix things, but somehow they kept missing each other emotionally. One wanted space, while the other wanted answers. One stayed quiet, while the other pushed harder. And one day they both realized something important had broken between them. The divorce was not loud or dramatic, but it was painful in a quiet way that lasted longer. Daniel rarely saw anyone from that part of his life after the divorce. Emily moved away eventually. Her father, Thomas, had never been fond of him anyway, so there was no reason to stay in touch. Only one person had reached out once after everything ended. Margaret? She had called him just to ask if he was okay. That call had surprised him, and he never forgot it. Daniel picked up a jar of strawberry jam and turned it in his hand, thinking about those memories. Then a voice behind him spoke his name. Daniel. The sound of it stopped him instantly. He knew that voice. Slowly, he turned around, unsure of what he would see, and there she was. Margaret Collins stood only a few steps away from him, holding a basket filled with fresh vegetables and flowers. For a moment, Daniel felt like time had folded in on itself. It was strange how familiar she looked. Her expression was calm and warm, just like he remembered, and the soft smile on her face made the busy market around them seem less loud. Margaret, Daniel said, surprised. Neither of them moved for a second, as if they both needed a moment to understand that this meeting was real. Well, Margaret said gently, this is quite a surprise. Daniel let out a small laugh. Yeah, I didn't expect to see you here. I usually come early, she said. Today, I was late. I guess that worked out, Daniel replied. They stepped a little to the side so people could pass. Daniel noticed he felt nervous, but not in a bad way. It was more like meeting someone important after a long time and not knowing what the right words should be. How have you been, Daniel? Margaret asked. I've been all right, he said honestly. Work keeps me busy most of the time. She studied his face for a moment, like she was trying to read what he was not saying. You still work at the architecture firm, right? Yeah, same place. I always thought you were very good at that, she said. Daniel smiled faintly. Thanks. There was something comfortable about talking to her again. The years between them started to feel smaller. Margaret had always been someone who listened more than she talked, and Daniel realized he missed that kind of presence in his life. "You look a little tired," she said gently. Daniel laughed softly. That obvious? I notice things, Margaret said. That hasn't changed, Daniel replied. They began walking slowly through the market together without really deciding to. It just happened naturally. They stopped at a stall selling bread, then another with fresh tomatoes. Their conversation moved easily from small topics to slightly deeper ones. Daniel told her about how Maplewood had changed a bit in the last few years. She told him about volunteering at the community garden and how she enjoyed spending more time outside these days. But even while they talked, there was something unspoken between them. The past was there, quietly standing with them. After a few minutes, Daniel asked the question that had been sitting in his mind since the moment he saw her. How's Emily? Margaret paused slightly before answering. She's doing well, she said. She moved to Seattle last year. Daniel nodded slowly. That's good. She has a new job she likes, Margaret added. A fresh start. Daniel looked ahead at the crowd moving through the market. Hearing about Emily felt strange, but not painful like before. Instead, it felt like hearing news about someone from another chapter of his life. I'm glad things worked out for her, he said. Margaret watched him carefully as he spoke, as if she was trying to understand how much of the old hurt was. Still there? Do you know? She said quietly. I always believed you two cared deeply about each other. Sometimes people care but still lose their way. Daniel didn't answer right away. He knew she meant well, but some things were complicated. Maybe, he said finally. They reached a flower stand filled with bright colors. Margaret stopped to look at them, touching one of the petals lightly. I'm glad we ran into each other today, she said. Daniel felt the same thing. Me too, he replied. Then Margaret said something that caught him completely off guard. I almost called you last month. Daniel blinked. Really? Yes, she said. I had your number saved for a long time. What stopped you? Daniel asked. Margaret looked thoughtful. I wasn't sure if it would be welcome, she said honestly. After everything that happened, I didn't want to make things harder. Daniel shook his head slightly. You wouldn't have... She looked relieved hearing that. There were things I wanted to say, Margaret continued. Things I never said before. Daniel felt curious now. Like what? Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, someone called her name from across the market. Margaret. The voice was loud enough that both of them turned at the same time. Daniel's stomach tightened when he saw who was walking toward them, Thomas Collins. Even from a distance, Thomas looked serious and focused. He moved through the crowd with steady steps, his eyes fixed on them. Daniel remembered those eyes well. Thomas had always been protective of Emily and cautious about Daniel from the very beginning. As Thomas got closer, Daniel felt a mix of old tension and unexpected calm. He wondered how this meeting would go. Margaret noticed the change in Daniel's expression and glanced toward her husband. Oh, she said quietly. Thomas reached them within seconds. He looked from Margaret to Daniel and raised an eyebrow slightly. Well, he said, I didn't expect this today. The air between them shifted instantly. Daniel straightened. A little. Good morning, Mr. Collins. Thomas studied him for a moment, his expression difficult to read. Margaret stepped slightly forward, sensing the tension building around them. We just ran into each other, she explained calmly. Thomas nodded slowly, but Daniel could tell he was thinking many things at once. The noise of the market continued all around them, music, laughter, people talking, but the small space where the three of them stood felt very still. Daniel realized something important in that moment. This meeting was no longer just a random surprise. Something bigger was about to happen, and he had the strong feeling that whatever Margaret had been about to tell him before Thomas arrived, this might change everything. Daniel felt the tension the moment Thomas Collins stopped in front of them. The sounds of the market were still loud, but for Daniel, everything felt focused on that small circle where the three of them stood. He had not seen Thomas since the day the divorce papers were signed. Back then, Thomas barely spoke to him. Now, the older man studied his face carefully, as if trying to understand what kind of person Daniel had become over the last 3 years. Margaret sensed the moment could turn uncomfortable, so she spoke first. She kept her voice calm and warm, the same way she always did when people around her felt uneasy. "Thomas, Daniel and I were just talking," she said. Thomas looked at her, then back at Daniel again. For a second, Daniel expected a cold comment or an awkward goodbye, but instead Thomas let out a long breath. It was not anger. It sounded more like someone carrying too many thoughts for too long. "Well," Thomas said slowly, "life is full of surprises." Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes, it is." For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Thomas shifted his basket to his other hand and looked around the market. "Busy place today," he said. Margaret smiled a little, relieved that the conversation was not turning into a conflict. "It's always like this on weekends." Thomas looked back at Daniel again. The serious look in his eyes had softened just a bit. "You still living here in Maplewood?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel answered. "Same apartment, same job." Thomas nodded once. "Architecture firm downtown." "That's right, I remember." Daniel did not expect that. For years, he thought Thomas barely paid attention to anything about him. The moment felt strange, but also calmer than he imagined. Then Thomas said something that surprised both Daniel and Margaret. "You know, Daniel, I spent a long time being angry after the divorce." Daniel did not interrupt. He just listened. "I thought you were the reason everything fell apart," Thomas continued. "I believed my daughter deserved better." Margaret looked at her husband carefully, but she let him continue speaking. "But time changes how people see things," Thomas said, "especially after you hear the whole story." Daniel frowned slightly. "The whole story?" Thomas nodded. "Emily talked to us more honestly after she moved to Seattle," he said. "She admitted that the problems were not only yours. Told us she felt lost in the marriage too." Daniel felt something shift inside him when he heard that. For a long time, he carried the weight of believing he had disappointed everyone in that family. Margaret stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Daniel, we never truly blamed you the way you might think," she said. "We were just trying to protect Emily." Daniel understood that. Parents always wanted to protect their children, even if it meant misunderstanding someone else. Thomas crossed his arms, but his expression was not harsh anymore. "Marriage is complicated," he said. "Two people can care about each other and still struggle to make it work." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's true." The tension that had been hanging in the air began to ease. People walked past them carrying bags of vegetables and fresh bread, and a group of kids laughed nearby. The normal life of the market continued around them. But something important was happening quietly between the three of them. Thomas looked at Margaret. "You told me this morning you wanted to talk to Daniel if you ever saw him again," he said. Margaret looked slightly embarrassed, but also calm. "Yes," she admitted. "I did." Daniel was curious now. "Why?" Margaret held her basket with both hands and looked at him honestly. "Because after the divorce, everything ended so quickly." She said, "One day you were part of our family, and the next day you were gone. It always felt unfinished to me." Daniel understood that feeling very well. "Sometimes I thought about calling you again," Margaret continued, "but I wasn't sure if it would make things uncomfortable." Daniel shook his head slightly. "It wouldn't have." Thomas glanced at both of them and then spoke again. "That's actually why I came to find Margaret here today," he said. "We were talking about old times this morning." Daniel was surprised. "Really?" "Yes," Thomas replied. We were remembering those Sunday dinners you used to come to? Daniel smiled a little. Those dinners had meant a lot to him back then. They made him feel like he belonged somewhere. Margaret smiled too. You always helped in the kitchen, she said. Most guests never do that. Daniel laughed quietly. You cooked a lot of food. I felt guilty just sitting there. That's why I liked you, Margaret said warmly. Thomas raised an eyebrow slightly, but not in a negative way. Daniel noticed something interesting in that moment. The energy between him and Margaret had always been easy. Even now, after all these years, the connection was still there. Not romantic in a strange way, but deep and meaningful. She had always understood him better than most people did. Thomas seemed to notice the comfortable tone between them. But instead of reacting badly, he looked thoughtful. You know, Thomas said, family doesn't disappear just because relationships change. Daniel looked at him carefully. That was not the kind of sentence he expected to hear from Emily's father. Margaret nodded in agreement. Exactly. Thomas sighed again, but this time there was a small smile on his face. I may not have said this before, he continued, but you were good to Emily in many ways. Daniel felt something heavy lift slightly from his chest hearing that. Thank you, said quietly. They stood there for another moment, and then Margaret looked at Daniel again with the same thoughtful expression she had earlier. Daniel, she said, would you like to have coffee with us sometime? The question was simple, but it carried a lot of meaning. Daniel was not sure what to say immediately, his mind filled with memories of the past and thoughts about the present. For years he believed that chapter of his life had completely closed. Now, suddenly, he was being invited back into a part of it. Thomas noticed Daniel's hesitation and spoke calmly. No pressure, said. Just a conversation, nothing more. Daniel looked at Margaret. Her eyes were kind and hopeful, not demanding. He realized something in that moment. For a long time he had been living quietly, avoiding emotional connections that reminded him of the past. But seeing them again did not bring only pain. It also brought warmth. I think I'd like that, Daniel said finally. Margaret smiled. With relief. That would be nice. Thomas nodded once, satisfied. Well then, he said, since we're already here, why don't we get coffee now? Daniel was surprised but also amused. Right now? Thomas pointed toward the coffee stand nearby where people were lining up. Why wait? He said. Margaret laughed softly. You see, Daniel, he hasn't changed. Daniel smiled. I remember. 3 of them started walking together toward the coffee stand. As they moved through the crowd, Daniel felt something unexpected. The awkwardness he feared earlier was fading. Instead, there was a calm feeling growing between them. They ordered coffee and found a small table near the edge of the market. The guitar music continued in the background, and the smell of fresh pastries filled the air. For a while, they talked about simple things. Maplewood's changes, new stores opening, people they used to know. The conversation moved naturally, without pressure. Then Margaret looked at Daniel again with curiosity. Are you seeing anyone these days? She asked gently. Daniel shook his head. No, I've been focused on work mostly. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair. Work can keep a person busy, he said, but it shouldn't keep you alone forever. Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe you're right. Margaret studied his expression carefully. Noticing the quiet sadness, he tried not to show. You deserve happiness too, Daniel, she said softly. Daniel appreciated hearing that, even if he didn't know what to say back. As they continued talking, Daniel realized something else. Being around Margaret again reminded him of the kind of warmth he missed in his life. She had a way of making conversations feel meaningful without forcing anything. At one point, their eyes met for a second longer than usual. And Daniel quickly looked away, unsure why his heart suddenly felt a little faster. It was not something wrong or uncomfortable, just a strange awareness of how important this connection had always been. Thomas watched them both, but instead of reacting negatively, he looked thoughtful again. Finally, after finishing their coffee, Thomas checked the time. "We should head home soon," he said. But this was a good conversation. Margaret agreed. Yes, it was. She turned to Daniel again. "We should do this again," she said. Daniel nodded. "I'd like that." They stood up from the table. The crowd at the market had grown even bigger now, and the sun was higher in the sky as they prepared to go their separate ways. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. She wrote something down and handed the page to Daniel. "Our number," she said, "in case you want to call." Daniel took it carefully. "Thank you." Thomas extended his hand. Daniel shook it, feeling that the old tension between them had finally eased. "Take care of yourself." "Daniel," Thomas said. "You?" "Too," Daniel replied. Margaret gave Daniel a warm smile before turning to walk away with her husband. Daniel watched them move through the crowd until they disappeared among the market stalls. For a moment, he just stood there, holding the piece of paper with their number on it. The morning had started as a simple trip for apples and bread. But now, something inside him had changed. Old doors he thought were closed had quietly opened again, and as Daniel walked back through the lively market, he had a strong feeling that meeting Margaret and Thomas today was not just a random moment.